Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. Tilleuls stood frozen at the corner of Rue des Tilleuls, his weathered hands trembling as they gripped his old leather suitcase. Where his little blue house should have been, where it had stood for 43 years, there was nothing but bare earth and scattered concrete chunks. The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty lot, making the destruction look like a mouth with broken teeth. His neighbor Madame Blanchefleur was watering her roses next door, acting like nothing had happened, like his entire life hadn't just vanished into thin air. The trip to see his brother Anatole in Marseille had only lasted 5 days. 5 days to say goodbye to the man who raised him after their parents died in the factory fire. 5 days to hold Anatole's hand as cancer took his final breath. Tilleuls had promised to scatter his brother's ashes in their childhood garden behind the old house. But now there was no garden, no house, no past left to touch. Just this gaping wound in the earth, where his memories used to live. He walked closer to the lot, his shoes crunching on broken glass and twisted metal. A yellow bulldozer sat silent in the corner, its blade still dirty with the remnants of his kitchen wall. That wall where his late wife Celeste had hung her collection of ceramic birds. Where their daughter Marigot had marked her height every birthday until she turned 18 and moved to Paris. The birds were gone. The height marks were gone. Everything that proved they had lived and loved in this place was buried under a pile of rubble. A man in an expensive suit appeared from behind the bulldozer, clipboard in hand, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Monsieur Tilleuls? I'm Reginald Montclair from the development company. I've been waiting for you to return." His voice was smooth as silk but cold as winter rain. He handed Tilleuls an official-looking document with red stamps and important signatures. The demolition was completely legal. Your property taxes were 3 months overdue. The city had every right to seize the land for public development. Tilleuls' vision blurred as he stared at the papers. 3 months overdue? That was impossible. He had always paid his taxes on time every year since 1981. His hands shook as he read the fine print, seeing amounts and dates that made no sense. The document claimed he owed 47,000 euros in back taxes and penalties, a sum so massive it might as well have been a million. The paper felt heavy in his hands, like it was made of lead instead of bureaucratic lies. But lies with legal stamps were still the law, and the law had eaten his house like a hungry beast. 3 weeks earlier, Tilleuls had been sitting in his kitchen peeling potatoes for Sunday dinner when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was weak and raspy, barely recognizable as his brother Anatole. "Theo, mon frère, I need you to come. The doctors say I have maybe a week left." The potato peeler slipped from Tilleuls' fingers and clattered to the floor. He hadn't spoken to Anatole in 2 years, not since their argument about selling their parents' old farm in Provence. Pride had built a wall between them, and now time was tearing it down with cancer's cruel hands. Anatole had always been the strong one, the older brother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on their table after the fire took everything. He taught Tilleuls how to fix engines, how to read the stars, how to make Celeste laugh when she was sad about losing babies they tried so hard to have. Now Anatole's voice sounded like autumn leaves crumbling underfoot. "I have things to tell you, Theo. Important things about the family. About money I saved for you. About mistakes I made that I need to fix before I go." The next morning, Tilleuls packed his small suitcase with 2 changes of clothes and the photo of Celeste that he kept on his nightstand. He locked his front door carefully, checking it twice like he always did. The blue paint was peeling near the handle, and he made a mental note to fix it when he returned. His neighbor's dog, a friendly mutt named Clovis, barked goodbye from behind the fence. The morning felt normal, peaceful even. Just a brother going to say goodbye to another brother. Nothing more complicated than love and loss, and the weight of time passing, On the train to Marseille, Théodule watched the countryside roll past his window like a movie he'd seen before. Fields of lavender gave way to rocky hills, then to the sprawling suburbs of the port city. He thought about all the things he should have said to Anatole during their years of silence. All the Sunday dinners they could have shared. All the stories they could have told about their childhood. Pride was such a foolish thing, he realized. It kept people apart when they should be together, especially when time was running out like water through cupped hands. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. Anatole was smaller than Théodule remembered, his face gray against the white pillows, but his eyes still held that spark of mischief that got them both in trouble as boys. "You came," Anatole whispered, squeezing Théodule's hand with surprising strength. "I wasn't sure you would." They spent the afternoon talking about everything except the cancer, sharing memories of summer days when they were young and thought they would live forever. Neither mentioned the argument that kept them apart. Some things were too small to matter when death was knocking at the door. Anatole's hospital room was filled with the beeping of machines and the weight of unspoken truths. On the second day, when the nurses had gone for lunch, Anatole pulled Théodule closer to his bed with trembling fingers. "Listen carefully, mon frère. I need to tell you about the money." His voice was so quiet Théodule had to lean in until he could feel his brother's breath on his ear. "Under the floorboard in my apartment, beneath the kitchen sink. There's a metal box with 50,000 euros inside. I saved it for 40 years, working double shifts at the docks. It was meant to be your inheritance." The confession hit Théodule like a punch to the chest. 50,000 euros was more money than he'd ever seen at one time. It was enough to fix his roof, to travel to help his daughter Marigot with her art studio in Paris. But Anatole's face was twisted with guilt, and his next words explained why. "I never told you about the box because I was angry. Angry that you got married, had a daughter, lived a happy life while I worked alone in that dirty warehouse. I know it was wrong to keep the money secret. I know I should have shared it years ago when Céleste was sick and you needed help with the medical bills." Anatole's eyes filled with tears that looked too big for his shrunken face. "The cancer came so fast, Theo. One day I was fine. The next I could barely breathe. I realized I might die with this secret, and you would never know what was waiting for you. I couldn't let pride steal from you one more time." He pressed a small brass key into Théodule's palm, the metal warm from being clutched in his dying brother's hand. "Promise me you'll take the money. Promise me you'll use it to be happy. I've been selfish long enough." That night Théodule sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair and watched his brother sleep. The machines beeped their steady rhythm while moonlight painted silver squares on the floor through the window blinds. He thought about all the times Céleste had cried quietly in their kitchen when the bills piled up like autumn leaves. All the times he'd worked extra hours at the garage, his back aching and his hands stained with oil, just to pay for her medicine. Anatole could have helped then. Should have helped. But anger had locked the money away like a treasure guarded by dragons. The next morning brought bad news from the doctors. Anatole's kidneys were failing faster than expected. He had maybe 2 days left, possibly less if his heart couldn't handle the strain. Théodule called Marigot in Paris to tell her Uncle Anatole was dying, but she was in the middle of an important art exhibition and couldn't leave until the weekend. "Tell him I love him, Papa," she said through static on the phone. "Tell him I forgive him for missing Mama's funeral. Sometimes people do stupid things when they're hurt." Her wisdom surprised him. When had his little girl become so wise about human nature and the weight of regret? Anatole died on a Tuesday morning while Théodule was buying coffee from the hospital vending machine. When he returned to the room, the machines had gone silent, and his brother's face looked peaceful for the first time in days. A nurse with kind eyes told him it happened quickly. One moment Anatole was breathing, the next he simply wasn't. Like he had finally given himself permission to let go after holding on for so many years. Théodule sat with the body for an hour, holding his brother's cold hand and whispering all the forgiveness he should have offered when warm ears could still hear it. The funeral arrangements were simple. Anatole had left instructions for cremation and a small service at the neighborhood church, where they'd sung in the choir as boys. Only a handful of people came, some dock workers who remembered Anatole's kindness, an old landlady who said he always paid his rent early, a baker who claimed Anatole helped him fix his delivery truck for free every month. These strangers knew a version of his brother that Tilleuls had never seen, a man who gave quietly to others while hoarding love from his own family. It made the forgiveness easier and harder at the same time. After the service, Tilleuls went to Anatole's apartment with the brass key burning a hole in his pocket. The building was old but well-maintained, with narrow stairs that creaked under his feet and wallpaper that remembered better decades. Anatole's one-bedroom flat was tidy and sparse, like a man who owned only what he needed and nothing that might tie him down. The kitchen was barely large enough for one person, but under the sink, just as promised, a loose floorboard revealed a metal cash box locked with the key his brother had died clutching.
Inside the box were neat stacks of euro bills, counted and bundled with rubber bands. Exactly 50,000 euros, just as Anatole had promised. But there was something else. A letter addressed to Tilleuls in his brother's careful handwriting. The paper was yellowed with age, suggesting it had been written years earlier and sealed away with the money. With shaking hands, Tilleuls opened the envelope and read words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Mon cher frère, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I hope you can forgive a stubborn old man who let pride poison what should have been our golden years together. The letter continued for 3 pages, telling stories of how proud Anatole had been when Tilleuls married Celeste, how he had celebrated alone in his apartment when Marigold was born, how he had wanted to help during Celeste's illness, but didn't know how to bridge the gap their argument had created. Every year on your birthday, I would take some money to put in this box for you. It was my way of loving you when I was too afraid to say the words out loud. The money is yours, but more than that, I want you to know that you were the best brother a man could ask for. I was just too foolish to say so while it mattered. Tilleuls left Marseille on a Thursday morning with 2 things that hadn't been there when he arrived: his brother's ashes in a simple wooden urn and 50,000 euros in cash, hidden inside his suitcase lining. The train ride home felt different than the journey south. The same lavender fields and rocky hills rolled past his window, but now they seemed touched with both hope and sorrow. Hope because the money meant he could finally breathe without worrying about bills. Sorrow because it had taken death to deliver what love should have given freely years earlier. The weight of the cash made his suitcase heavier than it should have been, but the weight of his brother's ashes made his heart even heavier. Anatole had asked to be scattered in their childhood garden behind the old house, the same garden where they'd caught fireflies in mason jars and buried their pet rabbit beneath the apple tree. Tilleuls planned to honor that wish the next day, after he had had time to clean the house and prepare for such an important goodbye. Some ceremonies deserved more than rushed tears and tired hands. As the train pulled into his home station, Tilleuls felt a strange lightness in his chest. For the first time in 20 years, he didn't have to worry about money. The inheritance meant he could fix his leaking roof before winter, maybe even take Margot on the trip to Italy she'd always dreamed about. Perhaps he could finally retire from the garage, where his back ached every evening and his hands never quite came clean of motor oil. The future suddenly looked brighter than it had since Celeste died 3 years earlier. He took a taxi home instead of walking, partly because the suitcase was so heavy with hidden money, partly because he felt like celebrating this unexpected gift from a brother who'd loved him more than either of them had known how to say. The taxi driver was chatty, talking about the weather and the local football team, but Tilleuls barely listened. He was imagining Anatole's reaction when he scattered the ashes in their mother's rose garden, how his brother would finally be at peace in the place where they'd been happiest as children, before pride and time had taught them to build walls instead of bridges. The familiar streets of his neighborhood looked exactly the same as when he'd left 5 days earlier. Madame Blanchefleur was hanging laundry on her line, the afternoon sun making her white sheets glow like signals of domestic contentment. The baker's dog still barked from behind his fence, recognizing the sound of the taxi's engine. Everything was normal, peaceful, unchanged. Tilleuls paid the driver and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, savoring the feeling of coming home to a place where he belonged. In a few hours, he would call Margot and tell her about the money. Tomorrow, he would say goodbye to Anatole properly. Life was about to get so much better. The train disappeared around the corner, leaving Tilleuls alone with his suitcase on Rue des Tilleuls. He looked toward his house and felt his heart stop beating. Where the familiar blue walls and red tile roof should have been, there was nothing but empty air and scattered debris. For a moment, his mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. This had to be a mistake. He must be on the wrong street, standing in front of someone else's empty lot. But there was Madame Blanchefleur's house with its yellow shutters. There was the baker's shop on the corner with its red awning. This definitely was his street. This definitely was where his house should be. He dropped his suitcase and ran toward the empty lot, his shoes slipping on loose chunks of concrete and broken glass. A few foundation stones were still visible, outlining where his kitchen used to be, where his bedroom had looked out onto the small garden Celeste had loved so much. The apple tree was gone, cut down and hauled away like it had never existed. The rose bushes were buried under piles of construction waste. Even the mailbox had vanished, though he could see the small hole in the ground where the post had been anchored for 43 years. Madame Blanchefleur appeared at her garden gate, her face carefully neutral as she watched him survey the destruction. "Monsieur Tilleuls," she said quietly, not meeting his eyes, "I wondered when you would return." Her voice held a note of something that might have been guilt or pity or both. She had clearly known this would happen, had watched it happen, and said nothing to stop it. The betrayal hit him almost as hard as the sight of his missing house. His neighbor of 20 years had witnessed his life being erased and hadn't even tried to warn him. "When?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "When did they do this?" Madame Blanchefleur twisted her hands in her apron, still avoiding his gaze. "On Tuesday morning. The bulldozers came at dawn. They said you owed money to the city, that the house was being seized for unpaid taxes. The man in charge had all the right papers, all the right stamps. There was nothing anyone could do to stop it." Tuesday morning, while he was sitting in a hospital room watching his brother die, strangers were tearing down everything he owned. A man in an expensive suit appeared from behind a yellow bulldozer parked at the far edge of the lot. He walked toward Tilleuls with the confident stride of someone who held all the cards in a game only one player understood. "Monsieur Tilleuls," he said, extending a manicured hand that Tilleuls ignored. "I'm Reginald Montclair from Montclair Development. I've been waiting for your return. We need to discuss your legal obligations regarding this property." His smile was sharp enough to cut glass, and his eyes held no warmth. This was the man who stole his house while he was saying goodbye to his brother. Reginald Montclair handed Tilleuls a thick folder of official documents, each page stamped with red seals that looked impressive and terrifying at the same time. "As you can see," Montclair said in a voice like silk wrapped around broken glass, "your property taxes have been delinquent for 3 months. According to municipal law, the city has the right to seize property for public development when taxes remain unpaid beyond the grace period." The papers felt heavy in Tilleuls' hands, covered in legal language that might as well have been written in a foreign dialect. Numbers danced before his eyes: 47,000 euros in back taxes, 12,000 euros in penalties, 8,000 euros in legal fees. "But I always pay my taxes," Tilleuls stammered, his voice cracking like a teenage boy's. "I've never missed a payment in 43 years. I have receipts, Bank records, proof of every payment." Montclair's smile grew wider, showing teeth that were too white and too sharp. "I'm afraid your records don't match the city's database," he said with mock sympathy. "Computer systems can be unreliable, especially when they're upgraded. Sometimes payment records get lost in the transition. Very unfortunate, but these things happen in our digital age." The explanation was smooth and practiced, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd used it before. Montclair pulled out a tablet computer and showed Tilleuls a screen full of numbers and dates that supposedly proved his guilt. But the dates were wrong, the amounts were impossible, and the whole thing felt like theater designed to confuse and intimidate an old man who didn't understand technology. "Of course, if you can provide documentation that contradicts our records, we're happy to review your case," Montclair said. "Although I should warn you, the appeals process can take years, and legal fees accumulate quickly." Tilleuls thought about the 50,000 euros hidden in his suitcase, money that could have solved this problem if it had arrived a week earlier. But even with Anatole's inheritance, he was still 17,000 euros short of what they claimed he owed them. And that was assuming their numbers were real, which everything in his gut told him they weren't. This felt like a con game, a sophisticated theft dressed up in legal costumes and official paperwork. But how could he prove it? How could one old man fight a system that had already bulldozed his house while he was grieving his brother? "I need time to gather my records," Tilleuls said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need to call my bank, talk to a lawyer, understand what happened here." Montclair nodded graciously, like a king granting a favor to a peasant. "Of course, take all the time you need, but I should mention that storage fees for your personal belongings are accumulating daily. We salvaged what we could before the demolition, but storage isn't free. You'll want to settle this matter quickly to avoid additional costs." He handed Tilleuls a business card that felt
Marigot's friend had indeed made the right connections. By noon the next day, a woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair and eyes like burning coals sat across from Tilleuls in the garage office, studying his tax records with the intensity of a hawk examining prey. Juliette Bellefleur was her name, and she specialized in exactly the kind of legal theft that had destroyed his house. "This is beautiful work," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm as she examined Montclair's paperwork. "Sophisticated, professional, and completely fraudulent. They've done this before." She spread his real tax receipts across the desk next to Montclair's fake documents, pointing out discrepancies with a red pen that moved like a surgeon's scalpel. "See these dates? They claim you missed payments in January, March, and May. But here are your bank statements showing automatic withdrawals on exactly those dates. They've created a parallel universe of fake records to justify stealing your property." Her anger was controlled but visible, like a fire burning behind glass. "The question is, why your house? Why you? There's always a reason with these development schemes." Juliette pulled out her laptop and began searching property records and city planning documents with the skill of someone who knew where corruption liked to hide. After an hour of typing and cross-referencing, she leaned back in her chair with a grim smile. "Found it," she said, turning the screen so Tilleuls could see a city planning map. His lot was highlighted in bright red, surrounded by other lots that formed a perfect rectangle. "Your neighborhood is being cleared for a luxury hotel and shopping complex. Guess who owns the development company building it?" The answer was as predictable as it was infuriating. Reginald Montclair's development company had somehow acquired the contract to build a 200-room hotel exactly where Tilleuls' neighborhood used to stand. The city had declared the area blighted and eligible for redevelopment, despite the fact that the houses were well maintained and the residents had no desire to move. "This is organized theft," Juliette said, her pen tapping against the desk like a drumbeat of justice. "They identify valuable land, create fake tax problems for the current owners, seize the properties for pennies on the dollar, then develop them for millions in profit." "Can we stop them?" Tilleuls asked, though he was afraid to hear the answer. Juliette's smile was sharp enough to cut diamonds. We can do better than stop them. We can destroy them. But it's going to take time, evidence, and probably some danger. These people don't like being exposed, and they have money to hire the kind of problems that don't solve themselves nicely. Are you prepared for a real fight, Monsieur Théodule? Because once we start down this path, there's no turning back." The fire in her eyes matched the fire growing in his chest. For the first time since seeing his empty lot, he felt like himself again, ready to fight for what was his. Juliette Bellefleur transformed the garage office into a war room, covering every wall with city planning documents, property records, and photographs of demolished houses. She had enlisted the help of 2 private investigators, and together they were building a case that looked like a crime novel written by angry angels. "Your house wasn't the first," she explained, pointing to red pins on a large map of the city. "They've been doing this for 2 years, targeting elderly homeowners in neighborhoods marked for development, always the same pattern: fake tax problems, quick seizure, immediate demolition." The pattern was simple and brilliant in its cruelty. Montclair's company would identify valuable land, then use their connections in city government to create computer errors that showed homeowners owed impossible amounts in back taxes. When the confused property owners couldn't immediately prove their innocence, the city would seize their homes and sell them to Montclair's company for a fraction of their value. By the time anyone could challenge the seizure in court, the houses were already demolished and replaced with luxury developments that generated millions in profit. "The beautiful part," Juliette said with bitter admiration, "is that it's technically legal. They're using real laws and real procedures just based on fake data. The computer records override any paper receipts the homeowners might have. It's bureaucratic theft disguised as municipal efficiency." She showed Théodule photos of 6 other elderly people who had lost their homes the same way. Most had given up fighting and moved in with relatives or into nursing homes. Their neighborhoods were now construction sites for high-end shopping centers and luxury condominiums. One of the private investigators, a quiet man named Bastien, who looked like he'd been carved from granite, had discovered something even more disturbing. "The city clerk who processes these tax seizures," Bastien said, sliding a photograph across the desk, "is Reginald Montclair's cousin. And the judge who rubber stamps the seizure orders, his daughter works for Montclair Development as a project manager." The web of corruption was like a spider's trap, with every strand connected to every other strand, all designed to catch innocent people and drain them dry.
"So, how do we prove it?" Théodule asked, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy, but energized by the clarity of the battle lines. Juliette's smile was predatory and beautiful. "We make them prove their lies," she said. "Tomorrow morning, you're going to walk into Montclair's office and demand to see the original tax records that justify your seizure. Not computer printouts, but the actual documents with real signatures and real dates. Watch how they react when you ask for something that doesn't exist." The trap was set. Now they had to see who would walk into it. Montclair Development occupied the top 3 floors of the newest office building downtown, all glass and steel, and the kind of expensive emptiness that said more about money than taste. Théodule rode the elevator to the 20th floor wearing his best suit and carrying a briefcase that Juliette had given him, along with specific instructions on how to spring their trap. "Remember," she had said, "you're not angry. You're confused and cooperative. You just want to understand the discrepancy in your records. Let them hang themselves with their own lies." Reginald Montclair's office was larger than Théodule's entire house had been, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and furniture that probably cost more than most people made in a year. Montclair himself sat behind a desk the size of a small airplane, his smile as perfectly manufactured as everything else in the room. "Monsieur Théodule," he said with fake warmth, "I hope you've come to discuss payment arrangements. Time is money, and both are accumulating interest while you delay." "Actually," Théodule said, settling into the leather chair across from Montclair's desk, "I've brought my tax records from the past 5 years. I'm hoping you can help me understand where the discrepancy occurred." He opened the briefcase and spread his receipts and bank statements across the expensive desk, watching Montclair's eyes for any sign of recognition or concern. As you can see, I have proof of payment for every tax bill going back to 2019. Perhaps there's been some kind of administrative error. For just a moment, Montclair's smile flickered like a candle in wind, but he recovered quickly, leaning forward to examine the documents with the performance of someone genuinely interested in solving a problem. "These are very impressive records," he said after a few minutes. "But as I explained before, paper documents can't override our digital database. Computer records are considered legally superior to physical receipts in cases of dispute." His voice was smooth, but there was tension underneath it now, like ice beginning to crack under pressure. "I understand," Tilleuls said, playing his role perfectly. "That's why I was hoping to see the original digital records, not printouts, but the actual database entries with timestamps and administrative codes. My daughter works in computer systems, and she says every legitimate entry should have what she calls metadata, information about when and how the data was entered. Could I see those records, just to satisfy my curiosity about how the error occurred?" The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Montclair's face went very still, and his eyes became as cold as winter stones.
"That's fine," Tilleuls said, standing and snapping his briefcase shut. "I'll just take my questions to the city council meeting next Tuesday. It's a public forum, and I'm sure the other residents will be interested to hear about the computer errors that keep targeting elderly homeowners in development zones." He walked toward the door with steady steps, feeling stronger than he had since the morning he'd found his house gone. "I'll also be interested to meet the city clerk who processes these seizures. I understand she's your cousin?" The phone receiver clattered back into its cradle as Montclair realized his prey had grown claws and teeth. "Wait," he said, his voice losing its smooth confidence. "Perhaps we can work out some kind of arrangement, a settlement that avoids the unpleasantness of public hearings and media attention. Bad publicity helps no one, don't you think?" But Tilleuls was already at the door, his hand on the expensive handle that opened onto justice. "I think," he said without turning around, "that some people deserve all the bad publicity they've earned." The elevator doors closed on Montclair's pale face and desperate eyes, and the war had begun in earnest. The city council chambers were packed with more people than Tilleuls had ever seen at a municipal meeting. Word had spread through the neighborhoods about the old man who was challenging the development company, and elderly residents had come to hear what he had to say about missing houses and fake tax bills. Juliet sat in the front row with 3 boxes of evidence and a smile that promised justice would be served hot and sharp. Local reporters had also gotten wind of the story, their cameras and notebooks ready to capture whatever truth was about to spill across the public record. When his turn came to speak, Tilleuls walked to the podium with Anatol's ashes in a small urn tucked under his arm and his brother's inheritance burning like righteous fire in his heart. "My name is Tilleuls Marquet," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed chamber. "5 days ago I buried my brother. When I returned from his funeral, I found my house had been demolished based on tax records that don't exist. Tonight I'm here to show you how Montclair Development has been stealing homes from elderly residents through fraudulent municipal seizures." The evidence unfolded like a story told by angels of accounting. Bank records that proved payments, receipts with official stamps and signatures, computer printouts that showed impossible dates and impossible amounts, photographs of demolished houses and displaced families, maps that revealed the pattern of seizures following development plans like a blueprint for organized theft. With each document, the murmur from the audience grew louder and the city council members grew more uncomfortable in their expensive chairs. Reginald Montclair had come to defend his business, bringing lawyers and briefcases full of official-looking papers that were supposed to prove his innocence. But when challenged to produce the original database entries that justified the seizures, their legal team began talking about proprietary systems and privacy concerns and trade secrets. The more they talked, the more obvious it became that they were hiding something rotten at the core of their operations. Truth had a way of making lies sound desperate and hollow. The turning point came when Juliet presented her final piece of evidence, a recording of Montclair offering to settle the matter privately if Théodule would agree to keep quiet about the computer errors. The recording was crystal clear, capturing not just the words, but the fear underneath them. "This is the sound of guilt trying to buy silence." The audience erupted in angry voices demanding justice, and even the city council members who had been paid to look the other way couldn't ignore the weight of evidence crushing down like an avalanche of truth. 6 months later, Théodule stood in the garden behind his newly rebuilt house and scattered Anatole's ashes around the base of a young apple tree that would grow tall and strong in soil enriched by justice and love. The legal battle had been fierce and expensive, but Montclair development had eventually collapsed under the weight of federal fraud charges and media scrutiny that exposed their crimes to the harsh light of public outrage. The city had been forced to compensate all the victims of the seizure scheme, and Théodule's new house was larger and better than the one that had been stolen from him. Marigot had come from Paris for the ash-scattering ceremony, bringing flowers from her art studio and tears of pride for a father who had fought giants and won. "Uncle Anatole would be so proud," she whispered as they watched the ashes disappear into the dark earth that would soon bloom with new growth. The inheritance had indeed paid for the legal battle, but more than that, it had bought something priceless. The knowledge that one old man could still make a difference when truth was on his side. The storage unit had yielded more treasures than Théodule had dared to hope. Céleste's wedding ring had been found in a box of kitchen utensils, and most of the photo albums had been salvageable with careful restoration. The ceramic bird collection was broken beyond repair, but Marigot had used the pieces to create a beautiful mosaic that now decorated the garden wall, turning destruction into art and loss into beauty. Some things, it turned out, became more meaningful when they were broken and rebuilt with love. Émile Rochambeau had been promoted to city automotive supervisor after his kindness to Théodule became part of the public record, and he still stopped by every Sunday for coffee and conversation about carburetors and human nature. Juliet Bellefleur had been hired by the State Attorney General's office to investigate municipal corruption statewide, armed with the evidence and experience gained from Théodule's case. Even Madame Blanchefleur had apologized, explaining that Montclair had threatened to seize her house too if she warned anyone about the demolitions. As the sun set over his rebuilt life, Théodule sat on his new front porch and opened a letter that had arrived that morning from another elderly homeowner in a distant city asking for help with a similar situation involving fake tax bills and threatening developers. He smiled and reached for his phone to call Juliet. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. But now he knew something important. Sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to keep fighting for the living. And sometimes when you think you've lost everything, you discover you still have the most important thing of all, the courage to stand up and demand justice, no matter how old you are or how big your enemies seem to be.